Hello, and welcome to Economy 2.0, brought to you by the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. My name is Josh Sidman. Today is our final episode of 2025. We'll be going on hiatus after today, and we'll start back up in January. So it seems fitting to end the season by bringing back some previous guests and one new one to discuss one of the most central aspects of our economic lives, the phenomenon of interest. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone that audience participation is always welcome. If you'd like to join the conversation, just click the Raise Hand button under the React tab on your Zoom toolbar. Also, as a reminder, these conversations are recorded and will be shared on the YouTube channels of both the Silvio Gesell Foundation and the Henry George School. Please like, subscribe, and share. And if you'd like to make a financial contribution, you can do so at silviogesell.com/donate. All right, let me bring our roundtable participants on screen. There's 1, 2, 3. All right. Joining us today are Willem Buiter, former Chief Economist at Citigroup, Felix Fuders, Professor of Economics at the Universidad Austral del Chile, and a newcomer to Economy 2.0, Ahmed Anwar, a lecturer in economics at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Welcome, all of you, to Economy 2.0. Thank you so much for joining us. Interest is a topic that has drawn the attention not just of economists, but of philosophers and religions since ancient times. Originally, Jewish, Christian, and Islamic law all prohibited the charging of interest. Aristotle considered interest to be an unnatural misuse of money. Interest is a phenomenon that we all become familiar with from an early age. We learn that when one borrows a sum of money, one is required to return not just the amount borrowed, but an additional amount as well. And conversely, when one lends, one is entitled to receive not just the amount lent, but an additional amount that we call interest. These facts are so universal that we assume they are normal and natural. But how many of us have ever stopped to think about all of this and ask if it really makes sense? Most forms of real, tangible wealth lose value with the passage of time. If I have a car, a bushel of wheat, a computer, a pile of lumber, a warehouse full of steel, all of those forms of wealth lose value with the passage of time. So why does money behave differently? If money is supposed to be a neutral medium to facilitate the exchange of real wealth, why does it behave in exactly the opposite manner from real wealth? Why does money increase over time when the vast majority of forms of real wealth lose value? There have been a number of different theories of interest proposed over the years. We'll get into the specifics of some of them during the course of this conversation, but let me first just mention them. A couple early theories of interest were the abstinence theory and the fructification theory. Abstinence said that interest is a reward for postponing consumption. Fructification says that interest is rooted in the growth principle of the natural world and reflects the generative forces of nature. Later on, the productivity theory and the time preference theory were proposed. The productivity theory says that interest is the share of additional output that accrues to capital as a result of making labor more productive than it would be without capital. And time preference says that interest is a reflection of the general human tendency to prefer present consumption over future consumption. Silvio Gesell described his theory of basic interest in the Natural Economic Order in 1916, which says that interest is an artificial, harmful phenomenon caused by the irrational design of money. And Keynes later built upon Gesell's theory to develop his liquidity preference theory, which says that interest is due to money's advantages as a form in which to hold wealth compared to other less liquid assets. So I'd like to start this conversation off by going back to an exchange that Willem and I had during his episode in June, during which I read the following excerpt from Silvio Gesell's book. Gesell wrote, "Metal money has been in existence for 4,000 years, has during 100 generations passed through thousands of millions of hands. Yet, in the management of money, every country in the world is guided not by science, but simply by routine. The lack of a sound theory of money is the reason why the phenomenon of interest has never been satisfactorily explained. For 4,000 years, we have paid and received countless thousands of millions in interest. Yet science is, at the present day, incapable of answering the question, whence and why does the capitalist receive interest? Attempts to solve the problem of interest have not indeed been wanting. As an obvious disturber of the peace, interest has received a far larger share of public and scientific attention than money. All economists of note have dealt with this problem, especially the socialists, whose whole effort is fundamentally directed against interest. But in spite of all these attempts, the problem of interest remained unsolved. The failure is not due to the difficulty of the subject, but to the fact that capital interest is the child or byproduct of our traditional form of money, and can therefore be scientifically explained only with the help of a theory of money. Money and interest, to superficial observers inseparable friends, have also a close interconnection, a connection in theory. A theory of interest can only be deduced from a theory of money. So I then asked Willem if he agreed or disagreed with the statement that the phenomenon of interest had not been explained, and he said he strongly disagreed. He went on to say, quote, "The interest rate is an intertemporal relative price. As long as there is time, and as long as there are goods and services available at different points in time, we can establish a price today for the delivery of that commodity tomorrow. That implies the interest rate for this commodity." I didn't have the presence of mind in the course of that conversation to recognize that there's not necessarily a disagreement between what Gesell wrote and what Willem said. So I think this would be a good starting point for today's conversation. Can we clear up this disagreement? Is there, in fact, a disagreement at all? As I thought about the two statements, it occurred to me that they're not necessarily opposed to each other. Willem said that as long as there is time and as long as there are goods and services available at different points in time, we can establish a future price for commodities, and the difference between the present price and the future price implies a rate of interest. That's obviously true. However, does it conflict with Gesell's statement? Gesell asked the question, whence and why does the capitalist receive interest? It seems to me that these statements can be reconciled. Willem says that intertemporal preferences will always exist, and those preferences imply a rate of interest. I think Gesell would clearly have agreed with that statement. However, I think he would have followed up that agreement by clarifying his own statement. Rather than saying that the phenomenon of interest hasn't been explained, he might have instead said that the fact that the rate of interest has been persistently positive over thousands of years is a phenomenon that has not been explained. So let's start by posing the question to Willem. If we change the word interest to positive rate of interest, do you still disagree with Gesell's statement? Do you believe there is a specific, generally agreed upon explanation for the existence of a positive rate of interest? You're muted, Willem.
I beg your pardon. I certainly don't believe that there is a theory of positive interest. Um, in part because empirically, of course, since there has been money and loans denominated in money, we have seen negative real interest rates uh, no, for hundreds of years now, on and off. Um, um, Negative nominal interest rates have been the great on money, have been uh, missing in action. And that, I think, requires an explanation. And I think the explanation is quite simply that the instruments serving as fiat money in a post-commodity society, that these instruments, for some reason, don't pay interest. um, and that, I think, is an anomaly having to do with the fact that paper money is messy to pay interest on. Yes, you can stamp it and require people to have it stamped on a regular basis, but that requires complicated and costly enforcement mechanisms. Yes, there is an anomaly that the nominal interest rate uh, has been well, only very marginally negative in the most recent decade ever, and it has been positive throughout history. That, I think, is an anomaly that can fortunately be eliminated by getting rid of paper currency and coins and replacing them by an interest-bearing central bank digital currency or stable coins or whatever. So yes, I agree with Gazelle if what he said was the paradox of uh, strictly positive in his time nominal interest rates. That is indeed an anomaly.
Okay, I guess then the first distinction we should go into is that between nominal and real interest rates,
Mhm.
because I would argue that that Gasel's statement was mainly about real interest rates rather than nominal interest rates,
Mhm.
and that we observe that real interest rates over centuries tend to um, average 3 or 4%
Yeah. Mhm.
positive, and that is a phenomenon that requires an explanation.
Can I come in here?
Of course.
So I think first we have to address what the state of theory was at the time Gazelle was writing, and there was a newly developing theory of interest, starting with Bern-Barwick and then Fisher, that you can explain positive interest with a combination of productivity and time preference. So what Bern-Barwick had explained is that productivity on its own can't explain a positive rate of interest. Fisher then has developed this theory. Now, the time preference, there are two aspects to the time preference that it's, I think, quite important to understand. One is just pure myopia, which is you just discount future utility. But the other is to do with the idea that you have diminishing marginal utility, in each period of time. And if capital is productive, then there'll be more goods in the future. So you can imagine with more goods in the future, you're going to have, let's say, the marginal utility has gone down to half as much. Well, in this case, you are willing to trade off two goods in the future for one good today. So that gives rise to this. This, I think, is what Willem was referring to in terms of these intertemporal prices. So productivity will give rise to more abundance of goods in the future and a rate of interest. Now, I think, first of all, Gazelle didn't accept the time, like Keynes, didn't accept the time preference explanation. So the question Gazelle is really asking in that quote is, why hasn't capital become so abundant that the rate of interest has come down to zero? And the answer in this kind of Fisher model is because of time preference. Now, we have to also add to this that both Gazelle and Keynes, in asking this question about interest being determined by the scarcity of capital, were anticipating a theory that was later developed on growth. So with growth theories, you look at what does a steady state look like when capital has been allowed to accumulate,
yeah,
and you've got some kind of equilibrium. And with these theories, we can see there are many possible explanations for interest. It could be technological growth or just population growth, or in the early, there's also two types of model that are used mainly in macroeconomics: overlapping generations and representative agent. The early overlapping generations model, the first one, Samuelson, didn't even have capital, so it was just population growth. And the idea is that money is a way that intergenerational wealth is transferred. It's a store of value. And with population growth, we can think of it now in the same way, that you've got the steady growth of population. So when you're saving, when you come to actually consume that, you've got a larger population that are producing goods. So you get interest that arises from this kind of dynamic. So we can then place the Gazelle-Keynes, I'll call it the Gazelle-Keynes theory, in this context of growth models, where they're making the assumption that there's no time preference, no population growth, no technological growth. And they're asking the question, so the steady states then would be that a capital will accumulate to the point where the return on capital is zero. And then their explanation, their alternative explanation then, is to do with this kind of property that money has, that it gives some kind of a service. Let's call it liquidity service. And if the return on capital is the same as the return on money, there's going to be a preference for holding money because it's giving, in addition to that return, some kind of liquidity service. And Keynes actually explains this this aspect. I mean, this is really developing the way Gazelle has explained it. But he has a chapter in the General Theory, chapter 17, where he has a way of explaining this as money having this, creating this lower bound on interest, because when the return on capital hits this lower bound, when it's hitting this kind of service you get from holding money, then people just prefer to hold money rather than capital. And we can, Gazelle was suggesting this was at 5%, and this explains the kind of persistent 5% interest that we've had through time. So I think I'll stop that summary there. It just places Gazelle and Keynes actually in the context of modern theory, and it's just perfectly consistent with modern theory, making particular assumptions.
May I just make one remark? I think we have to also note that even if we fully understand the theory of interest, the fact that interest on money and on loans has been viewed as usury, negative, as criminal throughout most of history, would still have to be explained, right? As I said, interest on loans is 3,000 years BC. It's 5,000 years old now, at least. The compound interest was first described in 2400 BC. But Judaism banned loans with interest between members, citizens of Israel. Christianity, for a long time, considered interest to be usury and banned it, and Islam still considers it riba, which has to be banned, right? And this, I think, is partly due to the fact that historically, as you pointed out, on average, interest rates have to be wildly positive, although there have been also extended periods of negative real interest rates, and that what was obnoxious about interest payments is that they are not attached to any form of risk sharing. The interest rate tells you this is what you pay tomorrow for what you borrow today, regardless. And so it was viewed as extremely risky, first for the borrower, because there was no contingency for uncertainty in his or her economic life. But of course, once bankruptcy occurs, if whatever assets are available that have backed a loan are not sufficient, then there is a major loss for the lender. So the lack of risk sharing in the classic interest rate agreement, the classic loan, is, I think, another reason for historical anger at the concept, which is on top of the problem of explaining why these rates have been positive most of the time. Thank you.
So in the course I gave on Silvio Gesell, I said, if Judaism, Islam, and Christianity and Aristotle all agree on something, that notion is worthy of serious consideration. Doesn't mean it's right, but it should be taken seriously. So for me, I think the most fundamental question is interest a natural reflection of the laws of the universe, or is it an artificial consequence of a mistake that human beings have made in arranging our economic institutions? And I think that in order to answer that question, we have to evaluate the various theories of interest and either accept or discard some or all of them. So Willem, when you and I had a little email exchange prior to this meeting, and you seemed to express the view that that there was a definitive academic view of interest, which is represented by Irving Fisher's real theory, which, as I understand it, is a combination of the productivity view and the time preference view.
Yes.
If you consider that to be the case, then that seems to imply that you consider interest to be, or rather a positive rate of interest, to be a normal and natural feature of our economic lives. Is that a correct understanding of your take on the phenomenon?
No, because the interaction of time preference and productivity over time can easily determine negative real interest rates. You mentioned yourself that many real stores of value, when left on their own, will depreciate in value over time. So that would be Of course, they can be used often in production processes that create additional value over and above the original value. But there's nothing in, I think, in the nature of technology endowments of real goods and services and time preference that would say real interest rates for let alone nominal interest rate would have to be positive. Right? I think the only anomaly I can see is that we have this strange instrument called money, which, when issued in paper form, pays zero nominal interest rate. And this prevents, because of liquidity preference type arguments, the nominal yield on other assets from going below zero, which means that we have a world in which materially negative nominal interest rates are simply ruled out. And that is a sorry world, because there could be situations with above equilibrium unemployment, below target inflation, and in which negative interest rates, policy rates, nominal rates, would be highly desirable to stimulate demand. This is ruled out by this artificial monetary asset, which is crying out to be abolished.
Okay, help me understand something. You've written a number of papers, if I remember correctly, arguing that central bank reserves should pay positive interest. Is that incorrect?
No, they should pay interest. Whether they should pay positive interest or negative interest depends on the economic circumstances.
Okay, so you're saying that that lever should be a feature available to you're muted.
Yeah.
All right, we've got a hand raised here. Cameron, if you want to turn on your camera, I can bring you on screen. Otherwise, you can just unmute yourself and.
Okay, my question for now is pretty quick, so I won't turn on my camera just yet. Basically, what you just said makes no sense to me whatsoever. Why would a central bank charge negative interest or positive interest, and then in some cases flip the switch to the other direction? Why wouldn't capital just scatter in that case instead of being held accountable for negative interest rates?
I must say, I regretfully don't understand the question.
How would the central banks enforce negative interest rates on loans or force people to take loans that evaporate? I don't understand. Can you explain more of that?
They can only set positive or negative rates on their own liabilities, right? And it then depends on the economic structure of financial markets, how private interest rates and returns on real private investments are related to the policy rates set by the central bank. Now, clearly, if I set a natural negative interest rate at the central bank, that means that banks have no incentive to to keep money deposited with the central bank, but they have every incentive for borrowing like crazy for central banks if the private returns on capital are positive. So this is a way of stimulating the economy. And conversely, when you raise the central bank's policy rate high, borrowing by banks and the associated lending by banks to other private counterparties would go down, and demand would contract. This is the standard monetary policy aggregate demand affecting mechanism. The central bank only sets its own rate. Arbitrage and speculative behavior by private entities link this policy rate to the interest rate and other rates of return on private sector assets and liabilities. Okay.
So,
Sorry, Josh, can I come in for just on
please.
to comment on this? Return a little bit to Gazelle's perspective and how it's different from this. So Gazelle wasn't so keen on central banks or governments taking a role in, managing the economic system in this way. The idea is more that you control the circulation, and the natural economic order will work very efficiently itself. And it might help to see that he proposed a solution to this problem, which was to stamp money. So this would prevent the hoarding of money in the first place, and it neutralizes this liquidity service. And this was very different from the solution Keynes saw for the same problem, which was something along the lines of managing the system. And in addition to kind of monetary policy, which would try and get the interest rate down so that loans, capital continues to be accumulated, he also saw a role for fiscal active government policy to fill the gap in aggregate demand by doing, having some state investment. Now, if we compare these two solutions, they're very, very different. So you see from the Gazelle solution is getting at the root of the problem, which is hoarding money, and it's preventing it right from the outset. The Keynes kind of solution is a solution in the short term because it is dealing with, it's preventing any deficient demand from arising. It's preventing this contraction. But what it's also doing is it's building up a greater amount of this kind of liquid wealth, because what the process that's happening here is the demands for hoards are being accommodated, and in the system as a whole, there's a greater amount of this type of wealth. So this is a kind of wealth that exists because there's a collective kind of belief in it. We're talking about government currency expanding, and what Gazelle saw was that he actually, he was proposing a fiat type currency where you have this, so it didn't have to be backed by gold. But he was seeing that if this was ever done without this dermarage, it's going to, the natural response of the government is going to be, or the central bank is going to be, to try and prevent a deflationary process starting by increasing the liquidity in the market. And he saw that this is just something that's creating an instability in the longer term, because with so much liquidity, at some point when things turn, you'll get very rapid increases in prices. And it's, Willem, I think, will reply that, if you've got someone managing the system, they will manage the inflation as well as the deflation. But we see that it's this managing it in the first place that's creating the problem that we're then having to solve. So, the inflations are created by too much liquidity being put in the first place, and then the whole thing collapses when there's too much of a boom, and you get a contraction that you have to control by trying to stimulate the economy. And the way Gazelle was thinking about this is that we would need no intervention whatsoever, because we're just controlling circulation right from the outset. To just to place Gazelle as somebody who's not so keen on this kind of central control of the system.
Yeah. May I comment on that? Because I think it's a very important insight. I think Keynes accepts the zero nominal interest rate on money as a given constraint. It's very different from Gazelle here. And so in his world, when you expand the stock of money endlessly, you press down the sort of liquidity value of money, and in the end you end up with a liquidity trap where the private sector willingly holds arbitrarily large amounts of the currency and doesn't spend it. And so to stimulate demand, you need fiscal policy. That's the Keynes world. Gazelle says no, we can reduce the interest rate on money to negative levels, deeply negative if necessary. And he proposes to do this in a world where there is, I think, somewhat exogenously given stock of money whose speed of circulation is determined by somebody, some entity, enforcing the payment of negative interest on the currency by stamping the currency. But it has to be a collective agreement. Joe Bloggs can't do this. So this is, in a way, what I would call Gazelle's central bank. And I view the alternative that I and others like Rogoff have offered for paying negative interest on government-issued currency, not by stamping physical currency. That could be done, but it's clumsy. It's much more easy to issue a retail central bank digital currency, which can pay positive and negative interest rates, and to set it at a negative level. So I view these proposals, the negative interest rates, on a fiat fiduciary internet-based money stock simply as a 21st century version of Gazelle's stamping money and in that way reducing its return and speeding up its circulation. So I view myself as being in no way contradictory of Gazelle's approach. This is simply something that he couldn't have thought of because we didn't have digital currencies, or let alone cryptocurrencies and fiat digital currencies.
But a difference that I perceive, Willem, you're certainly correct that Gazelle could not have conceived of the technological possibilities for implementing his ideas in the digital age. But I still think that there's a important difference between a currency where the interest rate is a lever that is being manipulated by central authority for the purpose of regulating economic activity in an active way versus Gazelle's perspective, which is that you simply need to completely separate money's functions as a medium of exchange and as a store of value, make it such that it is not appropriate for use for storing wealth in the long term, and that alone will result in natural market forces pushing the rate of interest towards zero, creating capital abundance, and resulting in a more robust, more stable, more fair economic system.
It's Gazelle's stamps on money and the costly process, the cost you have to pay to get it stamped, right? You only get 95 cents on the dollar back. Right? That is a collective social agreement that I would call the entity doing that the central bank, but you may call her the Gezellian Wirtschaft. But it is absolutely no different from the negative interest rate through CBDCs, because it is, in Gezel's case, the negative rate of return on money as an asset that causes people to speed up the circulation. So Gezel does not this sort of separate money's use as a means of payment and its speed of circulation from its store of value asset function. It's very much a store of value, and stamping it makes it a less attractive store of value, which people will want to spend. It's completely conventional economics.
Josh, can I come in again here?
Please.
I think it'll be quite helpful to just use this distinction, between Gezel's proposal to deal with the same problem that Keynes identifies. So, as Willem said, Keynes speaks of a liquidity trap. Keynes sees this role for fiscal policy. The 1930s, 20s, 30s, and 40s were a great time for debates, and Keynes had many. One was with Robertson about where the money comes from, and he eventually does accept this is new money that has to be created. There was this thing called a treasury view at the time that this would cause crowding out. So this is forwards are still being accommodated. This is new money, and so there is something different in this solution. So the idea is there's this new type of wealth being created relative to the Gezel solution, where you've just got money circulating more quickly. Okay, so if you think about the total amount of wealth there is in this form, there's much less in Gezel's solution than there is in Keynes. And it's exactly that large amount of liquid assets that may eventually causes an instability and starts an upward spiral. So to put it in the terms Willem is wanting to implement this policy, imagine you could have a digital currency now. The difference between Gezel's solution and Keynes' solution is right from the outset, your digital money would have this 5% tax on it. Okay, it would be from the beginning, and the circulation is controlled from the beginning. So you're not getting these periods of lots of demands for liquidity, and then suddenly creating upward spirals and collapsing into. So Gezel he was quite sophisticated in developing this theory into a theory of cycles, and he had actually got the ideas for a theory being in Argentina, where he had seen that this large amount of liquidity eventually created hyperinflation. And so this is why he was wanting to control the circulation from the outset and not have to come in at a later point to try and deal with rapidly rising prices.
You're muted, Willem.
It is hard to think of a world in which the negative interest or the positive interest, for the matter, on a currency could be applied and enforced without the backing of a government. And in my world too, when the central bank sets lower interest rates, including negative interest rates, the velocity of circulation increases. Keynes ran into a problem that you couldn't cut rates below zero, so the monetary velocity, there was no incentive to increase it beyond the level consistent with with a zero interest rate. Gezel's innovation was to come up with a mechanism for achieving a negative rate of interest in the pre-digital world. But the notion that a central bank doing this and possibly at the same time cutting rates and increasing the quantity of central bank currency is not at all contradictory to what Gezel did. It's the two instruments when there is no liquidity trap, when the interest rate can go down. As I said, you can have policy through interest rate cuts, negative interest rates, stimulating the circulation of the state-issued means of payment. And then also, presumably, of private means of payment, whose interest rates through arbitrage and speculation will be drawn towards the interest rates on a comparably slightly safer asset, central bank currency. So I don't see any meaningful contradiction in sort of my CBDC paying negative interest rates and Gezel's world in which a collectivity decides to enforce negative interest rates by taxing existing holdings of a particular currency.
I think this is great. If I can come in again, Josh. Also addressing something that Josh said about medium of exchange and store of value. So of course, money has to be this is Gezel understood that money has to be a store of value in the short term. This is why it doesn't work anymore when there's hyperinflation. But he is trying to separate out store of value and medium of exchange. This is central to what he's doing. So putting it in terms of Keynes's general theory, it's separating out speculative demand and transactions demand. So he's wanting money only to be held for transactions demand and not speculative demand. Now, of course, it's arbitrary to separate these two completely, but it helps to think in these terms. So the other important thing to understand then is if you were to have a central bank digital currency that right from the outset had a 5% interest in holding money, this wouldn't mean that the interest rate on lending money would be negative. For Gezel, this is just a loanable funds model determined in the market. So if there's scarcity of capital, that interest rate will just be, whatever that return on capital is. So the return on lending money, let's say, would be 5%, whereas if you hold on to it, you're getting taxed 5%. So there's a difference of 10% there. Keynes does seem like one of the explanations for his critique of Gezel seems to be that he wasn't separating out these two rates. He wasn't appreciating this separation. So where does the demand for money come from then? It's just for, there is still a demand for money. It's just for transactions purposes. So you can imagine a really high velocity of circulation. But the crucial thing is, however high that circulation, that velocity, it's going to be stable. So you've now got a system where you've right from the outset set this 5% tax on holding money. And this is just allowing capital accumulation to go on. And if we do accept Keynes and Gezel's zero myopic time preference, it will go on until capital is so abundant that the return of capital comes down to zero. And so both the return on lending money and return on capital then gradually come down from 5% to zero. And there's no longer a lower bound to prevent that from happening. And then you're in a steady state. Okay, so we've now got to the steady state without a lower bound interfering in this system. And again, the difference then is that you don't need a central bank managing the economy. And let me just say one more thing before Willem comes back in, just to anticipate something. I mean, in kind of macro literature, the main rationale for kind of central bank control of a system is, we have these kind of quite sophisticated models now where you get shocks to the system, and there are imperfections in the real system. So it's going to, it takes time, and the central bank can help the economy get back to equilibrium quickly. Now, one of the reasons for that is frictions associated with, inflation and deflation, prices changing, things like this. So here we're imagining you've got circulation that's being controlled, and that actually helps already to deal with many of these frictions. Okay, so you're not going to have, I mean, of course, if there's shocks, you can have prices changing. Just to put it in simple terms, when you control the circulation, you have something in economics called phase law, where you can't have a deficient demand in the system. But Say's law breaks down precisely because in the monetary system you can hoard money, and this is when there are shocks to the system, you're suddenly going to have incentives to hoard money, or to, if you've already had lots of hoards built up in the system because there's been a period of time where they've been accumulated, they can come out very quickly. But neither of these things are going to be possible in this system. That Gazelle is. This is why I see Gazelle was remarkably advanced in his thinking. That this is controlling all of those problems from the outset. I'll let Willem reply.
You cannot separate the store of value from the means of payment function of money. Transactions demand includes a significant component of what I would call speculative demand, because it includes the transactions demand for other financial and real assets. Right? When the central bank sets the policy rate at -5%, banks are going to borrow like crazy, and anybody else who can borrow from the central bank at that rate. And with the central bank digital currency, that will be individual households, and they would go out and not necessarily just in the first instance spend on goods and services, but spend on other financial assets, whose interest rates, whose yields, prices would go up, and therefore whose interest rates, whose yields would go down. And that then is transmission mechanism through the economy-wide interest rates that govern aggregate expenditure. So it is quite impossible to conceive of a means of payment that is not also a store of value and an asset. It is very hard to conceive of such an asset whose rate of return, if it became deeply negative, would not influence the yields on other non-central bank asset liabilities in the real economy. So we really should not get into the separating means of payment from store of value, from asset roles. The two are inextricably intertwined.
Well, I think a nuance that needs to be included is the long-term store of value. In order for money to perform the function of medium of exchange, of course, it needs to store value in the short term. It is the use of money as a long-term store of value that is the problem from Gazelle's point of view.
Sorry, I think what Willem is getting at is that if you have a change in policy like this, it's going to affect the whole system of rates. Now, so the idea is that we're thinking of some kind of steady state, Willem. So, this is, you're right. It's just a simple way of thinking about it by saying there's a clean division between medium of exchange and store of value. But this is no different from imagining a system that's got a constant pre-committed 5% rate of inflation. And we have models where we try to look at the consequences of inflation. And in fact, we have, on this idea, starting with Tobin, he had so Tobin 1965 looked at, trying to understand the consequences of having some kind of constant inflation. And he, in a portfolio kind of theory, does see the possibility that you're going to get a higher stationary state level of capital and consumption per person. And the simple reason is that because money is like a good substitute, when you have inflation on it and it's becoming more costly to hold, then you invest more relatively. Your portfolio is made up more of real capital rather than money, and in a steady state, this is going to mean a higher steady state rate of a steady state capital and a lower rate of interest. Now there are models following that. There's the really famous one is Sadrowski in a representative agent model. Shows that actually you have something called super neutrality of money. So irrespective of the growth rate of money, you're going to get the same steady state. But this is, it's not so robust, but you do get these results in these models. So we then have a whole kind of literature on this super neutrality. So this idea that you can have inflation affecting the steady state level of capital and real interest rates is, a standard in literature, and it's effectively the same as having a tax on money. So having a steady state of interest. So let me just finally say that this idea of separating out medium exchange and store of value. So again, we're thinking of a steady state. It's that at this level of inflation or this tax on money, it's not so large that you want to hold no money, because money is so valuable in providing transactions, transaction services. So it's necessary. In fact, we have models like cash in advance, where you can only buy things with money. So there's a demand to hold some money, but it's the crucial thing is stabilized. So you imagine it's already had its effect on the kind of structure of interest rates across different assets. But it's this is something that's not changing anymore. It's a constant kind of rate. So what you imagine is there's going to be some really high circulation of this money, because mostly people are going to be storing their wealth in other assets. They're going to be storing some of their wealth, Willem is right, in money. But it's only, according to their preferences, up to some point where those services are better than, passing. Now, the way models like the Sadrowski model incorporate money is they have just money in the utility function. There are other ways of doing it. And there are also models that suggest things the other way around. So you can have money in the production function, where more liquidity is a good thing because it reduces cost of production. And there are also utility models like that, where it's reducing search time because you've got more money, so it's making it less costly. So there are these models, but they say things both ways. And we're just this is just a particular model where having this tax on money, or this inflation tax, is increasing the steady state level of capital and reducing the interest rate. Sorry.
Felix, you want to chime in?
Yes, I would like to use this discussion on the store of value to come back to your initial questions, where interest comes from, the positive interest rate. It is actually, as Willem said, money, cash, is an artificial monetary asset with zero interest on it, neither positive nor negative. But this is where actually the positive rates for loans or time deposits, which can be seen as a loan to the bank, come from. Keynes believed we have this preference for liquidity. But why do we have this preference for liquidity? It's precisely because money is storable, cash is storable. That we would like to store wealth, at least for some time, is a natural behavior. Even animals do that. For example, bears store food in their belly for just the winter, and hamsters in their cheeks. So that we would like to store wealth, this is something natural. But this natural instinct to store wealth is kept in check by nature because everything is perishable. We can just hoard for some time, for a winter or two, but not for too long. But money, as it is designed today, with this artificial zero interest on money, we can hoard it. So if everyone hoards money under the mattress, it cannot circulate and cannot fulfill the second function, which is to facilitate the exchange of goods and services. So if money does not circulate, it's like the blood of the economy would not circulate. If blood does not circulate, then the economy gets ill. So why do we not store huge amounts of money under the mattress? It's because we have an interest to do so. This interest is the interest rate. The interest rate is, as Keynes defined it very well, a premium or a reward for parting with liquidity. And this is where it comes from. This reward for parting with liquidity is necessary since cash is hoardable. So it is precisely a reward to not hoard money under the mattress. But if we get this artificial store of value function from the money, then loans could get even free of interest. So if money was not storable in the same way as real goods are not storable for always, they're storable for sometimes, but not for a long time, the money would circulate by itself, would not need the positive interest rate anymore. And this is coming back to your original question, where interest from the positive rate has something to do with the artificial monetary asset cash.
No. Could I make a quick point on what would influence aggregate demand for goods and services, economic activity, is the long-term interest rate. I fully agree with that. If all the central bank can do is set the interest rate at -5% for a day, right, and there was no expectation or commitment to maintain this, it would have minimal demand on effective aggregate demand. So what is required for the negative interest and for that matter the positive interest rate channel to work in influencing aggregate demand is credible commitments by the central bank to maintain rates at whatever level they think is necessary for as long as it takes. That's forward guidance, credible forward guidance. So if the central bank credibly commits itself to keep the central bank rate at -10% for 10 years, then the 10-year rate wouldn't be much higher than -10%. So that's one thing. So that's it's key. That point is valid. Second, it's not part of my sort of view of the world that central banks, or for that matter, gazelles negative interest rate policy through taxation of currency, the stamping of currency, wouldn't necessarily be sufficient to stimulate aggregate demand back to full employment. Right? I mean, we could have, in principle, the policy rate at -10 or -100% credibly for the next 10 years with deeply negative real interest rates, but aggregate demand is not responsive to real interest rates. That could be the case. So all I'm saying is that what Gazelle does, it eliminates one obstacle to stimulating energy demand, which is the ability to lower nominal and through them real interest rates to the level that may be necessary to stimulate energy demand. Better, such negative rates would actually stimulate energy demand. It depends on the details of private consumption and investment behavior. So you could still have an unpleasant world with large and high and persistent unemployment, even if Gazelle's negative interest rates are part of the furniture.
Can I come in again?
Please.
So again, I think that we have to ask the question of how we get into this position where you've got unemployment, you've had a collapse, and the idea with controlling the circulation from the outset is, of course, there'll be shocks in the system, but you've got a system that now works efficiently. So markets will work efficiently to get back to some kind of steady state. And I know if you're using representative agent models, you can have these kind of liquidity traps where even inflation isn't going to help you because you just can't change expectations. But this is where you have to, you kind of like look at these abstractions that we use, which are great. These are not knocking the kind of models that we're using. They give us great insights. But one of the consequences of the kind of policies that we've seen, these kind of repeated periods of kind of like expansions and contractions. We don't have contraction so much anymore because central banks are quite effective actually at preventing contraction. So it's kind of like expansions and then periods of inflation like we've just seen. One thing they do is they concentrate. Well, there's a process through which, let's say, there is some process through which wealth has been concentrated. So we're seeing this in the figures. One of the possible mechanisms for this is through the expansions, you have a relatively small group of people who benefit. And then when there's inflation, everyone feels the squeeze. And, you do that a few times. Now, in a system that like we have now, where the inequality is so great, I don't think it would be difficult, actually, to get increased aggregate demand. And it wouldn't need any monetary injection. You just redistribute income. And you very quickly increase aggregate demand. And so but that's just, we want to have a system that doesn't produce this artificial kind of concentration of wealth through a financial kind of monetary system. And that, even if we assume the most benevolent intentions for central banks, this has been a consequence of this intervention. So it's something you have to accept, that policy hasn't been very successful. If we have some kind of social welfare maximization in mind, and either it's the case that the central banks and governments are just inept, or in a system that has so much concentration of wealth and power that the systems are captured and the outcomes are just what's in favor of this group that has this concentration of power. So the idea again is to have a system that, apart from the natural kind of flows of economic activity, don't have a we don't have a monetary system that creates an instability of its own. And I think just to be clear for Willem on this idea of separating out this interest you're getting on holding money from the interest you get from lending money. Now, of course, there's arbitrage always working. Okay, so these rates have to be the same. But this idea of separating these things out is to say you're making it too expensive to hold money as a kind of longer term store of value, but you're not making it so expensive that you're not using it as a medium of exchange. Okay, so there's some kind of in-between area here that is easily exploited. And we know money operates fine at 5% inflation or 10% inflation. It doesn't lose its status as a medium of exchange. So that we're still allowing, we're not talking about a central bank setting a rate, which then sets all the lending rates. Rates of interest will just be set in a competitive market. Okay, so that's going to be true for the rate you get if you lend money. So if we're right from the outset setting this 5% tax on holding money, there's still going to be a market for loans where the interest rate is determined. And like Keynes in the general theory, we're kind of like assuming this transactions demand is not so sensitive to the interest rate. So it's going to be relatively stable as interest rates change. And we're just dealing with that liquidity trap. Okay, so we're taking away that lower bound. But we're doing the idea is to do it from the outset. And the alternative is this kind of system where that's very good at dealing with short-term deficient demand, but it's never taking. I mean, this is something that many schools have suggested is the problem. The 1920s crash was a credit expansion. The end of the 1920s was a credit expansion. 2007 as well. There's something in the monetary system that's created the bubble that eventually creates the crash. So this is trying to prevent from happening in the first place. So now what Gazelle is at, so the Austrians will blame it on the credit of the banking system. The banks can create this credit. What Gazelle is saying that, well, that's just magnifying the problem, but there would be a problem even just with a government currency that doesn't have demurrage. So the way to introduce the fiat currency is right from the outset to say there's a 5% tax to holding money. And that's what, right from the outset, we're going to have a very fast circulation. There's going to be a small proportion of wealth held in this most liquid form now, but there will be some. But the majority of wealth will be held to store for longer periods of time. You're going to be buying, and you're free to buy anything you want, and you can cause whatever speculative bubbles you want. You're taking the risks, but you've separated that from the monetary system. So, if some speculative bubble crashes, it's not affecting the circulation. So there is an idea that he's effectively separating this kind of exchange system from the wider asset system. Insulating it, let's not say separating, insulating it.
But this is an assertion that even if you keep the total quantity of currency constant, right? If you somehow, if you reduce the interest rate on it and turn it into negative territory if necessary, you can achieve always a velocity of circulation necessary, sufficient to create full employment. That's absolutely untrue. There's no reason that's true. People could simply decide, now this is as fast as I can spend my money, right, at minus 10%. If you set it minus 15%, I'll just take the loss. I'm not going to run any faster from shop to shop to buy or sell my goods and services. So the Gazelle mechanism is also open to failure, inability to stimulate aggregate demand. So that's one point. The second um, point is an important one, that indeed the great aggregate demand disasters, the unemployment explosions of the Great Depression following 29, more recently, the great financial crisis and the following depression from 2007 2009 and the subsequent depression were triggered through financial crisis driven, of course, by the implosion of a bubble which had been encouraged by excessively lax central bank policies. Right? There is no doubt that the G7 central banks in the years preceding 2007 were feeding an unsustainable bubble in underlying asset markets like the housing markets, and then in the totally unregulated market for derivatives that most central bankers didn't even understand, like collateralized debt obligations and other securitized stores of value. So that, and it's very important to recognize that if you give central banks the ability to set rates, interest rates, positive and negative, and expand the quantity of central bank money at any rate they want, right? That creates risks and hazards because they can screw it up, and many do. Some are through errors, as I think was the case in most of the G7 before the great financial crisis, and some of it is by central banks being forced to act in demented financial, inflationary, and asset bubbly ways, like the central banks in Argentina. I thought Milei might have solved the problem, but he didn't, obviously. And also in central banks in many other emerging markets and developing countries, as well as, of course, in the hyperinflations we saw in European nations before World War II. So, yes, giving central banks this instrument is risky, but not giving an instrument means that you take away also an opportunity for them to become more effective by being able to expand the quantity of central bank money as well as reducing the returns to holding it. And therefore, so these are, I think, very important points. Gazelle addressed the cost, the opportunity cost of money as a key obstacle to stimulating aggregate demand, but it has to be recognized that even if that obstacle is taken away and you allow arbitrarily deep taxation of money, a la Gazelle, right, by stamping it and requiring people to cough up, that need not stimulate aggregate demand sufficiently to get us back to full employment.
If I can try to restate what I think I've heard you say, Willem, and make sure that I'm understanding it correctly. What I hear you saying is that Gazelle's reform is necessary, but perhaps not sufficient in all cases to accomplish what we all want, which is a robust, stable, and fair economy. Is that an accurate characterization of your statement?
Stable and fair requires so many other things, including taxation and regulation. I don't want to go there. I simply want to say, if we want to avoid unnecessary unemployment or excessive inflation, right? Those two classic objectives of monetary policy, then Gazelle is not sufficient. My alternative policy proposal of negative interest rate and a central bank that can increase the quantity of central bank money in any amount is in principle more powerful, but may also not be sufficient to achieve unemployment, right? Because it is possible that aggregate demand simply doesn't respond to deeply negative real interest rates.
Can I come in again?
Mm-hmm.
I see, Willem, it's going to be hard to persuade you that I'll just say that I don't have the same faith in central banks, the competence of central banks as you do. No, you kind of like you see that central banks have been partly responsible for those two particular booms and collapses. This is just, we don't know the truth of this, but there is a very strong idea here. I mean, I think the Austrians have this kind of idea as well. The problems that the central bank is fixing are always problems that it's created in the first place. Okay, so that's a kind of characterization of this way of thinking. And having faith in this kind of if you believe the potential of a system where you have a central bank, let's say, that whose only role is to issue currency and manage the price level, and right from the outset, it charges 5% on any holdings of this currency it issues. That you won't get this level of instability that possibly is being created. Now, I try to get across one of the ways in which it's created by using any kind of Keynesian solution, and it is there is a big difference in the amount of liquid wealth that gets built up in that kind of system where central banks are intervening to accommodate demand for liquidity. So one of the things that we should have said earlier is that in these steady state growth models, there is also an idea about optimal quantities of money and inflation rates. And there's something called the Friedman rule. So in something like the Sadrowski model, where you have this super neutrality of money, in fact, the optimal rule is it's the opposite of Gazelle. It's to have a subsidy for holding money or a negative inflation rate. So there are, and the Tobin effect is the opposite. This is the Friedman rule is countering the Tobin effect. So the reason the Friedman rule doesn't work in this kind of liquidity trap kind of argument is, and then thinking of it from Gazelle's perspective, is that there's an externality that by accommodating this demand for liquidity, which is great if you're just looking from an efficiency point of view, from individual optimization, this is well for maximizing, it's creating an instability in the system that in the longer term is going to cause more harm than any gain that you got in terms of the individual welfare. So it's like a system aspect to this. So we don't know the truth of any of this. We'd have to try to, it's right that you're going to get shocks to the economic system all the time. This Gazelle system, if the circulation is kind of like controlled in this way, suggests, I mean, that you don't need any intervention here. This is kind of like a decentralized solution. The economic system will adapt to shocks itself. Governments and central banks don't have a good record at doing this, and Willem seems to be keeping his faith in them despite this. But I think I'm more convinced by Gazelle's mistrust.
I have no great faith in central bankers. I was one myself for 3 years, and they were very good years. But I see that too often central banks get it radically wrong, even when their objectives are, for stable prices and full employment. And in addition, of course, central banks can be forced to act in wildly inflationary ways by governments who want to spend more, tax less, and have no longer any access to the capital markets. And so they use monetary financing. And that, I'm afraid, is an unavoidable, inevitable risk of having a society in which the means of payment, money, is provided by the central bank. I consider this a risk in most countries that is still worth taking, because without a central bank that can create money on demand, we don't have a lender of last resort for systemically important financial institutions if they threaten to go bankrupt and would cause a social disaster, or indeed for stabilizing systemically important financial markets when they go nuts, as the UK gilt markets did under Liz Truss 3 years ago now, when she and the Chancellor announced a crazily unsustainable fiscal policy, and the gilt market went nuts, creating serious risks for a large range of financial institutions. The central bank, the Bank of England, came out, intervened, said they would do it on any scale necessary. In fact, only had to do very limited interventions when they said we'll do whatever it takes, and reversed their large-scale purchases of sovereign debt within 3 months. So I think this is to take away that instrument, the lender of last resort and market maker of last resort, would be unacceptable to me. So I am going to have to live with the risk of central banks screwing up or being taken over through fiscal dominance by irresponsible fiscal authorities.
Okay, sorry, I saw, Felix, you were raising your hand. Just very quickly, I just want to respond to just what Willem said on these kind of financial markets. So you have to ask the question, why are the financial markets blown up so much in the first place that they're liable for collapse? That's something in the monetary system itself, and it's possibly to do with previous central bank policy. So again, it's trying to get at the root of the problem. Now, you wouldn't need a lender of last resort role in this kind of thing in terms of commercial banks, because this would be a 100% reserve type system. So the only money here is central bank money, and the commercial banks are acting just as intermediaries. So they're looking for people to lend them their central bank money that they're then loaning out. So this is a system that is already dealing with the kind of credit creation aspect of bubbles, and at least as a suggestion, it's possible that we don't get the blown up financial system here, because circulation, which is at the root of all of the valuing system, is being controlled. So many of the problems that you see make it necessary to give this kind of discretion to the central bank perhaps have been created in the first place because we've given them discretion in the past. I know, sorry, Felix.
Yeah, let's hear from Felix, and then we've got about a half an hour left. So after we hear from Felix, I'd like to zoom out and restate the original question. So Felix, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to come back to the question whether unemployment could be eradicated by Gesell solution. Willem said that Gesell's money tax or negative rates on cash and demand deposits would not be sufficient to create sufficient aggregate demand so that we get to full employment. However, the view from Sylvia Gesell was another one, that unemployment comes from a lack of aggregate demand. This is a Keynesian idea. But in the view of Sylvia Gesell, unemployment has to do with the positive interest rate and the opportunity cost that this creates. Any business that does not receive a return or profit which it could earn on a bank account or with lending money does not make sense. So businesses have to grow. This is actually where our unsustainability problem comes from. This is why we always have to grow, and then this is where we destroy the natural environment at the end. But not all businesses manage to grow. So the second best alternative for any business is to cut costs. And since human workforce is usually the most important cost category, this is why we see this dichotomy that we either grow or we reduce human workforce in the businesses. And this gives a constant pressure on the job market. Or we can say it in the other word, why do we always lack aggregate demand? It's because we have to grow so much and we do not manage to grow. And then Keynes comes up, yeah, we have to grow more. And how do we grow? Yeah, increasing aggregate demand. But we could also tackle this problem from the other way, getting rid of the opportunity costs, which steadily forces us to grow. And this was the idea of Sylvia Gesell. And see, according to Sylvia Gesell, this has to do with the positive interest rate. And his idea is a means or way to get close to zero interest rates for loans and negative ones for hoarding money and demand deposits or cash. And so according to Gesell, we can get to a full employment rate, unemployment as a full employment, zero unemployment by getting rid of the positive interest rate. And actually, we could also tackle the inequality problem, which is another big problem in the world, right? It's the inequality, because this has also to do with the positive interest rate, which makes deposits constantly grow. And since there is no interest without debt, debt also grows. So how can this be that in an economy constantly deposits grow, but also debt grows? This means that there have to be ever more people ever more indebted, while ever fewer people have ever more deposits. This is also a strong trigger of inequality, which is another big problem in the world today, right? So with Gesell's solution, we can get rid of, or at least strongly mitigate these two problems of unsustainability and inequality, and also unemployment, three problems.
Willem, you're muted. You're muted. Willem, you're muted.
I would definitely agree that being able to set negative interest rates the way Gesell does would mitigate the unemployment problem, the aggregate demand problem. Whether it would eliminate it is an empirical question. Depends on the sensitivity of the entrepreneurial activity to real interest rates. And estimates of that differ widely. So certainly in terms of solving the inequality problem, I mean, poverty is undoubtedly associated with unemployment. But even if we were to eliminate unemployment completely and permanently, there could still be extreme inequality with a lot of people living at or near or below subsistence, and a few trillionaires owning the world. So, and again, Gesell negative real interest rates and nominal interest rates might make life a bit less pleasant for people sitting on masses of financial real assets, the rich, but it would still not eliminate or necessarily put a significant dent into inequality. So I think, yes, the sign of Gazelle's effects are likely correct, but the magnitude is either doubtful or in some cases, as for inequality and poverty, I think totally unproven.
Yeah, you're true. The inequality will not grow anymore, but the inequality that we have already will stay. But in the long term, like in a couple of decades, this will start to mitigate itself. Maybe not, but at least it will not grow anymore.
In the interest of time and also in acknowledgement of the fact that this series is done in conjunction with the Henry George School, I'd like to engage with the Georgist perspective on interest and money, because this is a topic that I have crossed swords with a number of Georgists regarding, and I think it's important. This series exists because I was invited into the Henry George School in order to present the Gazellian perspective. Obviously, Gasell and George have very important points in common, but they also have some important points that are different, and I'd like to, and one of those is the topic of interest and money. So I'd like to throw out what I came across in Henry George's Progress and Poverty, his view on interest, and then also to state my understanding of what Georgists as a community advocate for in terms of the monetary system, in the hopes that if not coming to an agreement, we can at least better understand where each group is coming from. So I want to just read a quick excerpt from Progress and Poverty. Henry George writes that interest springs from the power of increase, which the reproductive forces of nature and the, in effect, analogous capacity for exchange give to capital. It is not an arbitrary, but a natural thing. It is not the result of a particular social organization, but of laws of the universe which underlie society. It is therefore just. So Henry George concluded that positive interest is normal, natural, and fair. And therefore, I have found the Georgist community to be quite resistant to the Gazellian prescription, which makes sense if they are starting from the perspective that interest is normal, natural, and fair. So how would any of the three of you address the Georgist community and and Henry George's view that interest is normal, natural, fair, and rooted in two things: the reproductive forces of nature and the capacity of human society to exchange and thereby create wealth collaboratively?
Can I respond? So I think, first of all, the reproductive kind of natural forces of nature. So, we did have these kind of theories early on. So Ricardo had this corn theory of interest that physically there's going to be, if you give up so much, you're going to get this physical return. Now, of course, that doesn't recognize that we're doing things in value terms. So as we create more and more corn, the demand for corn is going to go down. We're going to be wanting other things, and in fact, the other things we want are no longer produce of the land. You know, we demand things, goods that are not produce of the land. But just generalizing that kind of insight, what Henry George is saying there is that it's just because it's a fact of reality. So if capital is productive, we can say interest is just. And Gazelle wouldn't disagree with that. So Gazelle actually suggested the exploitation, usury as exploitation, is no different from trying to get a good price when you're bargaining with someone, exploiting the information that you have, etc. So the idea is, this is part of human nature. We're going to try and do the best for ourselves. And if you've got money that's valuable to someone else and they're willing to pay this interest, there's nothing unjust about that. There happens to be a situation where there's a scarcity of this and it's commanding a price. So there's no contradiction here. The difference is, what Gazelle is saying is, if there wasn't this barrier on the accumulation of capital, that natural rate of interest, that is, you know, it's natural, it would come down, and it would come down towards zero. So there's something unnatural in the system, in the monetary system, that's preventing the accumulation of capital up to this point where society can have, you know, this is also an idealization. You can imagine the real world is so different from this, because we've got constantly have technological advance and changing preferences and all sorts. So this ideal of capital being accumulated to the point where the return on it is zero seems a bit far-fetched. But at least there's not a barrier that prevents it. And there's two things about that barrier. One, that you're no longer getting capital accumulation. And the second, it's the start of an economic crisis and these cycles. So I don't see that there's a contradiction.
Could I make a comment on this? The natural, referring to the reproductive force of nature and the capacity of human society to trade independently, is simply, I think, a statement that you believe empirically that the marginal product of postponing consumption of capital is positive, right? And therefore, we would expect in well-functioning societies that on average, the real rate of return on financial assets be at least influenced by, not necessarily identical to the rate of return on investment in real resources. But the marginal part of capital is positive. I'd say yes, empirically, most of the time. It may no longer be the time in the future if global warming and climate change mean that returns to postponing consumption are going to be negative. Now, even if it is natural, of course, doesn't mean it's just. Right? There are many natural phenomena that are neither just or unjust. It's simply, it is what it is. And one of the problems, I think, with positive rates of interest. One of the problems of interest is that, to the extent as it is, as central bank money is, it's associated with unconditional payments, no element of risk sharing, right? It can be extremely hard on the borrower. So I think there has to be a mechanism for mitigating the default and insolvency risks associated with borrowing. We haven't addressed that, but I think it is empirically very important. So I would say it's been historically true, not quite the same as natural, that positive real interest rates prevail. And the fact that it is historically true doesn't mean that it is fair or just.
Yeah, I'm here with you, Willem, and also Anwar. I think that the idea that it is natural has to do with that they're conflating money with the production factor capital. I can invest capital and make money. That does not mean that money itself should have a positive interest rate. And since money does not produce, money does not produce, nor does it have offspring, as Aristotle already said at some point sarcastically. But interest in Greek is tokos, and tokos means offspring. But money does not have offspring. And you can try it. You can put some bills together with some romantic music, red light, nothing will happen. Bills will not reproduce themselves, and bills do not work either. And I asked lots of time to my 5,000 pesos bill clean up my kitchen, and the bill did not work. Money does not work, nor does it have offspring. It's people that work together with capital, with machines. But money is not a machine. You can buy a machine with capital, but it is with money. You can buy capital, but it is not capital. But if we conflate money with capital and believe that money produces, so then we cannot understand why this should be unnatural and unjust, actually. And I would like to show a graph that I always use, actually in my last book, with real data from the US, money supply and debt on the same graph. So money supply increases exponentially and the debt too. The difference between those 2 points, this is the inequality. This inequality has to do with interest, and this is an unjust interest, an unjust inequality. Not any inequality is unjust. If I work harder than someone else who does not work as hard, I should gain more than the person who works less hard. But here, people gain interest, gain money, not for their own work, but for the work of the people who get indebted. And they have to invest the money in their business or whatever they do. And if they fail, they have to pay. They still have to pay, because usually you get a mortgage on your house, or someone has to give a guarantee. If your business fails, you have to still pay. So there are people who receive money without moving their finger, that because of the work of other people and the risk of other people, at least at the most kind of loans. There are also some venture capital loans. There maybe a positive interest rate might be justified as a risk premium, but most loans, the risk takes on the person who takes the loan and who works productively. So here's an inequality that increases exponentially and unjustly. And maybe we can see it this way. Imagine a world without products. There's nothing, only money. What would be the money worth? Well, nothing, right? So who gives the value to the money? It's the people who produces products and services, real products and real services. In many cases, these are the persons who take the loans. So instead of charging interest, they should be thankful to the people who take the loans and produce products and services with their effort, instead of charging interest.
All right, we got 10 minutes left. Let me one more time reorient the discussion in terms of contemporary political and economic debate. When I was thinking about how to present the Gessellian perspective in the course that at the Henry George School, I chose to call the course Beyond Capitalism versus Socialism, because it was apparent to me that the Gessellian perspective, the Gessellian critique of interest as being one of the fundamental drivers of economic inequality, economic instability, and other problems, has no place in that spectrum, in the conventional spectrum of economic dialogue, in which economic policy debates are viewed as being lying along a linear spectrum between capitalism and socialism. So given all that we have discussed relating to the centrality of interest to the economy, where how do we orient ourselves with regard to contemporary debate? Where does this fit in to all of the discussions that take place on TV, online? How does this relate to conservative versus liberal, to Democrat versus Republican? How do we advance this perspective in today's world, given the state of economic consciousness and dialogue?
May I start? Yeah, the two biggest problems today discussed, I think the most important problems everywhere in Chile and in the US and Europe is inequality and unsustainability, right? Climate change, destruction of the environment. Both have to do with a positive interest rate. The positive interest rates is the opportunity costs of any productive investment. So businesses that do not grow, at least at that pace, doesn't make sense at the long run. So if we grow, what happens if we grow? We produce more, we produce more, and we need more input because there's no product without input and without energy. So even if we try to be more efficient and use green energy and circular economy, but if we keep on growing, at the end, we will use more energy and more inputs. And it's obvious that we destroy the environment if we keep on growing. The growth imperative has a lot to do with the positive interest rate. It's not just greed. And the second problem, the inequality I just mentioned with the graph, deposits grow and debt grow in the likewise manner and according to an exponential mathematical function. And this produces inequality and even an unjust inequality. And communism or socialism would not be the solution, but just a backwards oriented curing of symptoms. We can tax the rich and give it to the poor, of course, but better would be if we would try to avoid from the beginning this inequality. And this has a lot to do with getting real monetary neutrality, to have a money that flows and circulates without a positive interest being necessary. And of course, we have to do many other things. We have to get rid of monopolies, collusion, unfair competition. Yes, those classic market failures we have to fight too. But all this has to be based on a monetary system with real monetary neutrality. And then we can get rid of these two major problems. And so I think these ideas of Silvio Gesell are very contemporary. They trigger or they tackle those problems which are most discussed today.
I view inequality and unsustainability as just two of the key economic problems that have to be addressed in almost every society today. I would add, and it's also my view that positive or negative interest rates and the inability to set negative rates is not strongly central to the discussion of inequality and sustainability. Where they do matter is in the other economic objectives: full employment, stable and low inflation, and financial stability. Okay? There, the ability to set possibly deeply negative nominal rates is an essential instrument. I do not view this as a socialist or capitalist problem. I think both pure forms no longer exist, fortunately, and modern societies are a strange convex combination of the two. But these problems, full employment, stable prices, inequality, unsustainability, and financial stability, are inherent in what we do every day. But and Gesell addresses two of them: inflation and full employment, but not the others, in my view.
Yes, actually, you're right. I just forgot them. Also, in unemployment and inflation and financial crisis could be strongly mitigated with Gesell solution. Yes.
So what Gesell is proposing is different. It's like a libertarian socialism, and it has its roots in Proudhon, who saw that actually the problems were in the financial system, and capital's great, and we want to accumulate more of it. It's not the enemy to socialism. And just responding to Willem here, the idea starting from Proudhon and Gesell kind of adds a solution that can actually work to this, is that looking at that graph that Felix had in debt, inequality does arise through the financial system. It's not arising because there are natural difference in productivity of people and they're getting rewards for their work. It's that when you've got assets that are created from debt and they can expand very quickly, you can get returns on money far in excess of anything you can get from productive capital. And what we're seeing with this concentration of wealth, it's mostly come in the last 20 years from rising asset prices. So we've got a system where there's something in this financial system that's causing this strange kind of wealth that relies on a collective will and belief and institutions to support it, expanding completely out of proportion to the real economy. And I think in the UK, I did look this up just before starting, the wealth to GDP ratio has gone up from 3 or 4 to 1 to 7 to 1 in recent years. Over I think a 15 or 20-year period. So you're getting this concentration of wealth arising because we have a financial system that allows this type of wealth to be created. Now we don't have time to go into it now, but this is, there's something curious about this type of wealth, that it, obeys its own laws. It relies on this kind of collective belief. These are really strong institutions we're talking about, the Fed and the Bank of England, and also US Treasury, and they're able to support this amount of wealth, but this is wealth that is concentrated. So just to answer your question, capitalists and socialists would welcome this reform if it does what it says it's going to do, because it's recognizing that there is a return to capital, and there's nothing. I actually agree with Willem that just is not the right word to use, but there is something natural about a system where someone is doing something productive and getting returns for it. I like these ideas, risk sharing, etc. But socialists will like this idea because it's actually getting at the root. Now, the strange thing here is it's possibly government spending on welfare in the longer term, because if it's creating debt, is blowing up, partly responsible for blowing up asset prices. That's creating the inequality. So, more responsible budgets so that we're not blowing up debt is part of that solution. So socialists are, currently seeing this the wrong way around. So it's recognizing the roots of root causes in the monetary system.
Yes, and the concentration of wealth again then produces other market failures, or triggers other market failures, as the monopolization, because those people who earn so much money without moving a finger then can invest it productively, actually, in a monopoly. And then we see these classic market failures even increasing because of this monetary system we have right now. You're muted, Josh.
Sorry about that. Yeah, let's leave it there. Thank you so much. Willem, Ahmed, and Felix for joining us today and putting the icing on the cake of the season of Economy 2.0. It was great having you guys. Thank you to Ibrahim and Kuba at the Henry George School. Thank you to the audience for joining us every week. We'll be, as I mentioned at the top, we'll be taking the rest of the year off and starting back up in January. So thanks to everyone, and have a good holiday season.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.
Thanks, friend.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.